Hello and welcome to the Knit and Grace podcast. Let's talk about knitting with unspun yarn. Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Mia and I am the maker behind Knit and Grace. And today I am bringing you a long-awaited, much requested video on knitting with unspun yarn. If you are a returning viewer or you have watched a couple of my podcast episodes, you may have figured out that I am a big lover of knitting with all of the unspun yarn. And, you know, in my comments and over on Instagram, I often get questions about knitting with unspun yarn, questions about tips and tricks and things like that. And I think even in one of my recent Knit and Chat episodes where I asked you all to ask me a question, someone mentioned about my love for unspun yarn and any tips and tricks that I might have. So I thought that I would sit down and film this little video for you all. So I will preface this by saying this is probably not super exhaustive. So if this is kind of probably maybe part one. I'm just really kind of putting out the basics. If there are any additional questions that I don't cover that you might have, feel free to leave them in the chat box below and I can definitely follow up with another video. Also, the way that I plan on filming this video is I'm going to sit down and sort of chat through all of my recommendations. I'm going to show you some of the unspun yarns that I have knit with, as well as some of my swatches, and then I will also insert B-roll footage of not only the swatches but also the yarns and some of the projects that I have knit with unspun yarn as well. And so I have sort of a few questions or a few topics that I'm going to go through. I'll figure out how to like divide it up by chapters for you all so you can easily navigate through the video, since this will probably be a little bit of a longer one. And yeah, I guess I will just jump right in and get started. So I guess first things first, we should probably get started with what is unspun yarn. And unspun yarn is actually exactly what it sounds like. It is yarn that has been combed and it has been sort of gotten ready to the point before it's actually spun up. So typically when you think of, your typical worsted or woolen spun yarns, you have multiple plies of yarn that have been spun separately and then plied together. You could also have a single spun yarn, which is just one strand of yarn that has been lightly plied. So there's just no twist to the yarn. So unspun yarn is often called pre-yarn. It's also often called pencil roving. So it's just yarn in its pre-spinning state. So there's no twist at all to the yarn. And so why would you want to knit with unspun yarn? For me personally, I mean, I definitely tried unspun yarn as, you know, sort of a curiosity. I started following Melody Hoffman over the pandemic times, and she knits actually a lot with unspun yarn, and I really loved her aesthetic, her patterns, and I wanted to try knitting with some unspun yarn. And so some of the qualities that make knitting with unspun yarn really nice is that it gives you just a really warm fabric while while it's still being light. So it's very lightweight for the same amount of, let's say, woolen spun or worsted spun, even definitely worsted spun, than you know, those types of sweaters. So let's say if you knit a sweater, if you were to knit the same sweater in an unspun yarn, a woolen spun, and a worsted spun, that's kind of how they would rank from the lightest weight to the highest weight. So it's especially nice if you're knitting really oversized and bulky garments as well, so that you can make yourself a really nice oversized cozy item of clothing without it being super heavy, which it can get if you are knitting, let's say, with a worsted spun yarn. So that's kind of one of the main reasons why you knit with an unspun yarn. Also, the quality of unspun yarn itself gives it a really pretty like halo effect. So a lot of the times you can get that same effect that you would get when you're knitting, let's say, a fingering weight held with a mohair together with just a single strand of unspun yarn. And like I mentioned, again, the items that are produced with unspun yarn are extremely warm. The fibers themselves are very grippy because they haven't, you know, they have no twist to them. So they want to sort of grip to each other. And so over time, actually, as you wear some of these garments, they will start to felt to your internal temperature. So as you wear them, and, you know, your natural body oils and sweat and heat from your body will create a naturally like felted fabric almost, but it's still very light and airy, and you can still will be able to see all of your stitch definitions, but like on the inside it kind of creates just this really warm and cozy type of fabric. So with regard to unspun yarns, there are more and more coming out on the market. So I wanted to show you 4 of the unspun yarns that I have either knit with or will be knitting with, and I have available to me. And these are probably some of the well, I wouldn't say more readily available, but these are, you know, I'll sort of let you know the availability of the yarn. So I have a big pile of different unspun yarns here next to me that I will walk you through. So first up we have Plotulopi, which is an Icelandic unspun yarn, and this is 100% Icelandic fibers, and this is going to be probably your most readily available of the unspun yarns. Now, I will say with some of their natural colorways, so their undyed colorways, they will run out of stock at certain times of year because of the shearing schedule. So sometimes the natural colorways aren't as easy to come by, but they come in 100-gram plates, and so this is, I think, just a little bit less than 1 plate. I do think I used a little bit of this. And this is what it looks like. So this is a plate of Plotulopi. And this is in one of their undyed colorways. And this is the color 1030. And so that is what, let's see. That is what one strand of the unspun looks like. Let's see here. I'm trying to, there we go. So this is going to be probably your not toughest, but your more workhorse of the unspun yarn. This is the one that I would recommend if you're a beginner. It's not as fragile as some of the other yarn blends. However, because of that, it can be quite itchy. So I have knit hats and things with it, but I don't find that I'm like very itchy on my forehead. But if I do have a couple garments in Plotulopi, I would suggest either holding it with a mohair to soften it up, or just wearing it under like a t-shirt underneath your garment, because this is also, it's probably the easiest to work with because it's the most rustic of the unspun yarns. So that is Plotulopi. Then next up I have Nutiden, which is another one of the most popular unspun yarns. However, it is a little bit more difficult to come by because they do release their yarns by shop update, and then once they sell out of a color, it's gone forever. They don't recreate colors, so everything is one of a kind, and they sell out pretty quickly. The cool thing about Nutiden is that each color is also blended differently. So depending on the color, they'll have different properties to the yarn itself. So I actually have two colors here for you to see, and you can see so you can see kind of the difference here. These are both 100-gram plates, so they come in 100-gram plates. And you can also buy them in a 300-gram or 500-gram bags as well. But this is what 100-gram plates look like. And depending on the spin, you'll see like the plate here, this purple plate, which is a color called Lola, is much denser than the bottom plate here, which is a color called Vasen. Even though, and this is due to the fact that each of their blends is different, and so some of them are going to be thicker than others. And so I'll show you what the strands of these two look like. Maybe I'll perfect this by the end of the video. So this is what those two strands look like. So you can see that the Lola is a much thicker blend than the Vasen, and so that also means that it's a little bit more dense. The Vasen is a lot airier. And then depending on the blend also will depend on how rustic the yarn is. Some of the blends are a lot more rustic. I find these two blends are very soft, but I did pull out I bought this color, which is one of their natural whites that they did last year, called Duvkula. And so I bought this one in a 500-gram bag, so I don't have full 100-gram plates of this one. But I'll show you the difference. In this one, this actually is an extremely thick spin of Nutiden. So depending on the season that they're creating the yarn, depending on if it's summer or winter, depending on the blends that they use, depending on the dyes that they use, you'll get different results. So like this one, I would actually say can probably be knit very easily as a single, but some of their blends you really would want to knit holding double because there might be a more light blend. So the other unspun yarn that I want to speak to is from Woolen Twine, and this is called Thrive. And so if you're familiar with Eula and Woolen Twine in general, she stocks sort of her basic bases that she gets all the time, and then she has limited editions, which her unspun yarn is classified as a limited edition. And so she'll usually put out a couple of colors at a time, and then once those colors are gone, they're gone and they can't be recreated. So they also come in 100-gram plates, and so this is what her plates look like. And so this particular color, it's a colorway called Rye. And this was, I believe, introduced in her November 2022 collection, or might have been September. And so I have some of it here that I've started knitting with to show you what those strands look like. So you can see it is a bit of a thicker strand. However, it is still, it's not as fragile as some of the Nutiden yarns, but it does have quite a bit of bounce to it. And so this one, I would say you could probably knit single, or not you can knit single or double. And I actually have my sample that I have to show you in Thrive is actually knit single on smaller needles. And then the last yarn that I have to show you is Manchelopis by Wool Dreamers. And so this one is a little different because this one also comes in 100-gram plates. So that is a 100-gram plate of Manchelopis, and I believe this is the color light gray. However, the difference is that Manchelopis, and I'm trying to find the end here, already comes in a double-stranded, oh, here we go. Oh, that's weird. I'm not sure how my strands got separated. So Manchelopis already comes plated up in 2 strands. So you can see the 2 strands there, and that's how it comes plated up. So with this one, if you wanted to knit it single, which you can definitely knit it single, you would actually have to unwind the plate and sort of ball it up into single balls. And so yeah, so this one is, I think it's a little bit more readily available than the Nutiden and the Thrive, but it's not as readily available as the Plotulopi. So in terms of, as I mentioned, how readily available some of these yarns are, Plotulopi is going to be probably your most readily available. Manchelopis is probably going to be your next readily available. Nutiden, I will say it's pretty readily available in terms that they have shop updates often throughout the year. However, you know, the sort of, not the preference, but sort of the first round of who gets the yarn goes to the Patreon subscribers, which I happen to be a patron of Honorier. And then they have shop updates to the public afterwards, and their yarn does sell out very quickly because they are limited batches. So Nutiden is probably more readily available in general than Thrive, but it is, you know, kind of a little bit harder to come by in terms of during their shop updates and whatnot. And then Thrive is probably the least with regard to how readily available they are. In terms of softness, as I mentioned, Plotulopi is going to be your least soft, most rustic of the yarns. Then I would probably say Thrive. So let me hold Thrive and Manchelopis. So I would probably say Manchelopis, Thrive is a little bit more rustic than Manchelopis. And so the reason for that is Manchelopis is actually, it's actually very like springy. When I was knitting with this yarn, I was like very shocked at how springy it is. It kind of feels almost like like knitting with a woolen spun yarn. So that would probably, so Thrive would be a little bit more rustic than Manchelopis. And then I would probably say Nutiden is going to be your softest of the yarns. But again, that is probably dependent on the blend itself. Because for instance, like this blend, the Duve Kula, is a lot more rustic than the Manchelopis. But like this Lola blend here is very soft. And so I guess because these are all 100-gram plates, I'll hold them up together so you can kind of see how they look. And so this is the difference. So here we have Plotulopi on the bottom, we have Manchelopis, we have Nutiden, and we have Thrive at the top. And these are all 100-gram plates. So now I will get into my tips and tricks of how to work up unspun yarn. And so first is, which yarn would I start with? In terms of easeability and also just accessibility and most importantly probably price point, I would probably start with Plotulopi, and that's actually where I started. It's a lot easier to handle, especially if you want to work with the yarn single versus having to hold it double, and it can give you the feel for how to knit with unspun yarn. And so the reason why I say that is, if you haven't already noticed, or if you don't already know, unspun yarn is actually very fragile. So for instance, if you are pulling, because there's no twist, so if you are pulling from the plate like this, you actually don't have to pull very hard for the yarn to come apart. And so the reason for that is because it doesn't have a twist. But the reason why this works up in knitted fabric is that although there's no twist and it's easily fragile in its long form, when you actually have, so I'll come up close, your yarn and you're pulling on it, sort of, you see, like, I can do it, but it's a lot harder to pull apart from a short staple length. And so this is based on the staple length of the fibers that are used for the yarn. And so what that means is essentially how long the hairs are that they're using to make the yarn. So because you have longer staple lengths for unspun yarn, if you are pulling it or putting pressure on it on a shorter length basis, it's pretty strong. It's very strong. And so the when you're thinking about a knit stitch is not a very large stitch, right? So that's why the yarn can actually hold its shape when you're knitting it up. So other than starting with a stronger blend or more rustic blend of the unspun yarn, I would say to also start with a plain stockinette pattern, especially if you are not knitting a pattern that is designed for unspun yarn, or even better, if you can start with a pattern that is actually designed for unspun yarn. And so if it's a pattern that's designed for unspun yarn, they're going to take into account some of the properties that are unique to knitting with unspun yarn when it comes to the way that the pattern is formatted. However, you can definitely knit patterns that are designed for standard yarn with unspun yarn, and I actually have knit quite a few patterns that are knit or designed for standard yarns with unspun yarns. But I think that the basic place to start really would be a plain stockinette pattern, preferably in the round, so you can really get the tensioning down. And so that's going to be my next tip for you, is to really practice your tension when it comes to unspun yarn, and definitely gauge swatch. So unspun yarn is going to act a lot like a regular traditional non-superwash yarn, where it's not going to grow a lot. However, so like in size, where like if you're knitting with a superwash fabric, sometimes, you know, or yarn, sometimes you can knit a sweater and when you go to block it, it like is like 3 times its size because the yarn has no memory. So the yarn does have memory. It's not gonna like grow outrageously in size. However, the stitches do bloom quite a bit. So sometimes, you know, where you think that you'll need, I often actually will knit with a larger gauge needle than if I had knit with you know, with a standard size, depending on the pattern. And sometimes I'll knit with a smaller gauge because you do need to get a hang of the tensioning. So essentially when you are knitting with unspun yarn, you don't want to tension your yarn the way that you would traditionally tension your yarn if you're knitting with a traditional yarn, because this could cause the yarn to break, especially because as you put pressure on it, even though you're not putting pressure on it on the specific knit stitches that you're going along, over time you'll be putting pressure on the thread itself, and then it's easily pulled apart. So you actually want to just work on your tensioning. So personally, when I tension my yarn, knitting normal or like with a standard yarn, I actually sort of wrap it around my pinky and then hold it over my left finger like so. My left index finger, because I am a continental knitter, but actually I do the same when I knit English. So when I knit English, I wrap it around and wrap it around this way. And so that's how I tension my yarn when I'm knitting with a traditional yarn. When I'm knitting with an unspun yarn, I don't actually tension at all. So when I'm knitting English with an unspun yarn, I simply just pick it up and twist it. And then when I'm knitting continental, what I do is, and I don't have a needle here with me, but let's say the needle is in my hand, I actually will have a grip on the yarn and the needle. So like I have my left finger, and so I'll grip the yarn between my hand and the needle lightly to lightly tension the yarn. And so I'm not really doing any active tensioning of the yarn, and that takes a little bit of practice. When you first start knitting with the yarn, you will definitely break the yarn quite a bit, so that's something that you'll just need to get used to until you get the hang of knitting with this specific type of yarn. In addition to practicing your tension, one of the things that I would recommend if you are knitting single for the first time is pairing it with a mohair, because the mohair or the silk mohair is going to give, you know, give you a little bit more strength as you go along, so you won't put as much pressure on the unspun yarn, and so the silk mohair will help to sort of keep everything going without a lot of breakage. Also, if you are someone like me who tends to row out because I'm a continental knitter, I would recommend going down a needle size for your purl rows. Or you could also do Russian purling, which will also help even out your purl gauge when knitting with unspun yarn, because you can't really tension the yarn. And so what that looks like is, so I work typically with interchangeable needles. So let's say if a pattern is going to call for a US size 7 needle as my main needle, and that's where I got gauge on, I will have on my cord, I will have a 7 on one side and I'll have a 6 on the other side. And so a 7 is a 4.5 and a 6 is a 4 millimeter needle. And so what I'll do is on my knit rows, I knit across with my size 7 needle, and then on my purl rows, when I come back, I'm purling across on my size 6 needles. And so that will also help to even out some of that row gauge discrepancies when it comes to purling. I actually also do this sometimes when it comes to knitting patterns that I'm knitting with standard yarn as well, especially if I'm knitting a pattern that is knit both in the round and knit flat. This is actually a trick that I have learned to make sure that I don't row out. And so with that all said, as I mentioned, I am a continental knitter, and I will say knitting continental with unspun yarn is actually much easier than knitting English. However, it can definitely be done knitting English. There are plenty of people who knit English actually, and I apologize, I have fibers everywhere. Melody Hoffman herself, who is one of the bigger unspun yarn knitting designers, knits English with unspun yarn. I believe Weechin of the Petite Knitter also has a few patterns that are knit with unspun yarn, and I know that she is a English style knitter, so you can definitely do it. It's just a matter of really paying attention to your gauge, because as an English knitter, you're going to naturally have a tighter gauge than someone who knits continental. And so with that, in general, one of the things that I like about knitting with unspun yarn is that it forces you to slow down when you're knitting, which I admittedly am a pretty fast knitter, not because I try to be, just I naturally do have a faster knitting speed, but knitting with unspun yarn really forces you to slow down and really be intentional about your next stitch, the way that you're holding your yarn, the way that you're holding your needles, etc. So I find it to be a very pleasurable and meditative experience. So now we'll get into sort of how to knit with the yarn itself. Like once you figure out, you know, what yarn you want to use, your tensioning, do you want to knit with it single or double? And so that's really going to be dependent on the yarn that you're using. And it's also going to be dependent on the pattern that you're knitting. And so you can knit, let's say like a Plotulopi, you can definitely knit with any of their blends single. Again, it's a pretty, I have no clue where my ends are. It's a pretty workhorse yarn. It's not very fragile, and you can just knit it single. And so then what I do is when I knit single, I just pull from the outside of the plate. It's very simple. I also recommend with any of these yarns, if you are knitting them single, or like the Manchelopis, which is double, it already comes plated double, you always want to work from the outside and not from the inside. The reason why is because the yarn on the inside is always going to have more pressure built on it, just based on the spinning. So that way, if you're pulling from the inside, it's actually going to like break a lot more. Now, if you are working with it double, I do recommend pre-balling your yarn. And so my yarn balls have escaped. So what that means is you're actually just balling your yarn into balls. And so these are two Nutiden colors that I have balled up double. So the top one is Yarnvelia and the bottom one is Vanessa. And so I just ball them into these little balls, and you can see that is the two strands together. And so this is going to make it a lot easier to knit than trying to pull from the inside and the outside. And so now what I will do is, if I am knitting with it double, I will put two plates next to each other, and I'll pull from the outside of both plates as I ball, because that's a lot easier. Now, if you just have one 100-gram plate and you want to ball it up double, you will need to sort of kind of pull out the inner guts of the yarn, and then sort of start balling it from the inside and the outside to get some of that yarn that has already sort of built up some of that tension in there. And so typically what I will do is I will pull out some of the guts of the inside, and then find whatever the outer string is of that inner guts, if that makes sense. I keep saying guts, but that's kind of your yarn vomit, which, you know, isn't a very much nicer way to say it. So I'll start pulling from the outer part of that little inner yarn vomit and the outer part of the main plate, and ball that up until I'm done. And then I'll continue with the outside of the main plate and the inside of the main plate, which now has a nice little hole, so that the yarn isn't really breaking and splitting because of the fact that it is going to want to stick on itself. But now the thing that is very nice about the fact that unspun yarn is very sticky, wants to stick on itself, and is fragile, is that you can spit splice. So you don't have to weave in any ends. Whenever you're done with one ball or one plate, you simply just take another strand, you put it between your palms, rub, 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 and there you go. Your yarn has been attached and you can keep knitting. So that is a nice feature or property of knitting with unspun yarn. And lastly, I think one of the biggest tips is when it comes to casting on or binding off, especially some of the cast-ons or bind-offs that require a longer tail, I recommend sort of felting the yarn a bit before you actually start that process, because that will help give the yarn a little bit more of a sturdy nature. And again, the way that you would do that is just by simply rubbing it between your palms to felt up that yarn a little bit and give it a little bit more strength as you're tugging on the yarn. And this would go be the same thing too for weaving in your ends. Once I've completely bound off, I will felt that end a little bit, and then I will go in and weave in all my ends. So to wrap up the sort of tips section of the video, which at this point is very long, I guess I will talk to two things, which is first, how to determine how much yarn you will need, and then secondly, how to care for your items that you've knit with unspun yarn. So when it comes to determining how much of the yarn you will need, a lot of the yarn, because again it's in this unspun state, it's not very easily measurable when producers are plating it up essentially. And so and also the meterage or yardage will depend on how fluffy the yarn is or how sort of rustic the yarn is. So for instance, like a Plotulopi will have a lot more meterage than like a Nutiden, or will have a lot less meterage than like a Nutiden per 100 gram, because a Plotulopi is going to be heavier. It's a little bit more heavily spun versus, or you know, spun than a Nutiden yarn, which is a lot more lofty. So yeah, so typically what I would say and what I have, you know, sort of heard around and what I stick to is, if you think of a medium to large garment for a woman, that's going to be about 500 grams of unspun yarn. And so I personally knit typically an XL to 2XL, so I'm usually in that 5, 6, 7 size range for patterns. And so I typically will actually fit into that 500 gram range for my size. However, that's because I am very petite. So I often have to shorten my patterns by quite a bit. So I end up saving in length so I can actually get an entire sweater. And this is holding the yarn double with 500 grams of yarn. Now, if you are, let's say, an XL to 2XL, you're probably looking in that 700 gram range. And if you're like a 3, 4, 5XL, you're probably looking in that 8 to 900 gram range. And then obviously if you're a smaller size, you're looking at less yarn. And so that's when you're considering holding the yarn double. When you're considering holding the yarn single, that's again going to be determined by the pattern that you're knitting. I think usually like around 300 grams is going to be sufficient for a, you know, let's say if you're holding it single along with a mohair. And then the yarns themselves do have somewhat of a guesstimate in terms of the meterage and yardage as well that you can go off of. So like Plotulopi and Manchelopis have pretty accurate meterage counts that you can use. Again, with a Nutiden, because it varies by the blend, you can always reach out to Caroline of Honor Acquier and she can help you determine how much yarn you will need. Similarly, EULA of woolen twine gives you approximate meterage and yardage for the yarns. So always recommend just getting a little bit more than you would think. So if you think that you need like 500 grams for a pattern, maybe get 600 grams so that you don't run out, especially if it's sort of a more limited type of yarn that you can't get your hands on very easily, especially because I've personally found, and just even from my own personal experiences, folks that have this yarn, they're not usually looking to destash it, unless they've completely knit with something and then have some left over, which I did recently, destash some yarn. But so yeah, so that's kind of how to determine how much yarn you're going to need. With regard to the care itself, I care for it very similarly to how I care for my other non-superwash patterns, or samples I should say. So when it comes to blocking, I'm going to soak it in lukewarm water for about 20 to 30 minutes. I do have a spin dryer. So what I do is, you sort of block everything, you put it in I actually soak everything. So I soak it in my wool wash. I recommend a wool wash that has lanolin in it, like eucalyptus. So I'll soak it in lukewarm water for about 20 to 30 minutes. By that point, the water's pretty much become cold. You just don't want to shock water. So you don't want to put it from like very cold temperatures into hot temperatures, because the fibers will felt. And so what I do is I just gently squeeze out all of the yarn or the water. And so typically what I do is, like, I have a big basin, I like sort of tip it over so most of the water comes out. And even the way that I put it into the water, I kind of put it in kind of almost pre-folded. And so when I am taking out of water, I kind of then just kind of like fold it up into a little bit more, and then I just kind of like press down on it to get as much water out while it's either in the tub or the sink. And then I do my towel sandwich, where I lay the item out very flat in its shape so it doesn't get misshapen. I roll it up, I kind of stomp out all of the water, and then what I do is then I put that, so like the sweater rolled up in the towel, into my spin dryer, and then my spin dryer will get the rest of the water out. Similarly, if you have like a traditional washing machine, you can put it in your washing machine's spin cycle if your washing machine has a spin only cycle. But I would be a little bit more careful with that, because your washing machine is a lot bigger, so it's a lot more likely that the item is going to agitate in there, versus like I have a spin dryer, so it's very small. It's meant to sort of dry small amounts of clothing and things. So the items that I'm putting in there aren't getting tossed around, because again, if it's being tossed around, it's going to get agitated and it could felt. So hopefully this video hasn't gone on too long, but I do want to show you some swatches that I have with the various yarns that we have discussed today, and then ultimately I'll also put in some b-roll of the different projects that I have knit with these yarns. And so I have a bunch of swatches here that are sitting next to me, and I actually have one little bit of a finished item because I don't have an actual swatch to show you. So the first swatch that I have to show you is of Nutiden held double, and this particular colorway was called Roa. And you can see this one was a bit of a finer, it was an undyed, and it was very fine. It was lanolin heavy, so it created this really nice, just really flowy fabric, even though I held it double. And so that is what it's looking like. Then this is actually a swatch of Manchelopis. And so again, this is with Manchelopis held double, and you'll notice that this is a lot loftier. This is actually, you can kind of see where the stitches are extremely plump, and it's just super, super airy, and it kind of looks like very lightly felted material when you see it in person. And so, let's see, I have 2 swatches of Plotulopi here. And so, the beige swatch is Plotulopi held double in a rib pattern. And then the darker swatch is Plotulopi held single. And so there you can kind of see the difference in the fabric. Yeah. And then for Nutiden, I actually do have a swatch of it held single, but held along with a mohair. And so this is a color that was called Harden, and I've held it doubled with a silk mohair. And so this is what the swatch looks like. As you can see, I started out with at a bigger gauge, and then I was trying out various gauges until I found the one that I liked. And so this is actually one thing that I guess is a tip when it comes to your tension, is often when it comes to these yarns, I actually like to gauge swatch first and then find a pattern, unless it's a pattern that specifically calls for unspun yarn, because then that way you can kind of see how the yarn is going to behave. Especially because with something like a Nutiden, each of the blends really acts very differently. So for instance, this is another Nutiden blend where I held it double, and this is that color Vanessa. And then last but not least, I do have a sample that I knit up with Thrive. And this is of Melody Hoffman's still to be released Runa mitts. And so she designed this pattern specifically for Thrive. And then the contrasting color is actually Plotulopi. And so here, Thrive is being held single. So you could see you really get a nice even fabric, even when you're holding it single. And then you could even see the difference between Thrive, which works up a little bit thinner than the Plotulopi. But again, unspun yarn is really great for color work because it really just loves to stick to itself. So yeah, so those are my swatches, and then I'll go ahead and put in some B-roll of some items that I have knit using unspun yarn with a little bit of voiceover. Here you will see 2 examples of hats that I knit with Plotulopi, one held double and one held single. This first hat is the Wild Posy Hat by Melody Hoffman, and I knit it with Plotulopi held double on US 7 needles. And the second is the Belfair Hat, and I knit this one on US 4 needles or 3.5 millimeter needles. Next we have my Stockholm Sweater by Petite Knit, and this sample is knit in Nutiden held with a silk mohair. I knit this on US 5 or 3.75 millimeter needles, and as you can see, it gives quite an airy fabric. This is my Caroline Shawl by Bella Clark of 100 Acre Wool, and I knit this sample with Nutiden held double. I used a size US 10 or 6 millimeter needle, which gives a quite open gauge for a nice flowy fabric. This is my Ranunculus by Midori Hirose, and I also knit this one on US 10 or 6 millimeter needles with Plotulopi held single along with a silk mohair. Here you can see how the silk mohair helps to fill in the gaps so that the fabric is light and airy but is still somewhat opaque. And here you can see the halo that the silk mohair gives the piece. Here we have an example of Plotulopi held double on its own in my Wild Posy by Melody Hoffman. I used US 9 or 5.5 millimeter needles, and while you can see a lot of similar texture details, you can tell that the fabric is much denser, but you still have a little bit of a halo from the unspun fibers. Then we have the Saglan Pullover by Albina McLaughlin, and this is knit in Nutiden held double on US 7 or 4.5 millimeter needles. Here you can see the stitch definition of a 2x2 rib, which I've really come to enjoy in unspun yarns. And you can also see the halo that is caused by the unspun yarn. Another example of Nutiden held double is my Sommer Ella by Lena Holm Samso, and this sample was knit on US 6 or 4 millimeter needles, which produces a much denser fabric but gives really great stitch definition to the cabling along the yoke. Here we have the Aito wrap by Melody Hoffman, and this is knit in Plotulopi held single on US 7 or 4.5 millimeter needles. This is a pattern that is designed for unspun yarn, so you will actually notice that Melody incorporates the use of spit splicing to incorporate and blend the colors in between each of the lace sections. Lastly, we have the Runa Mitts by Melody Hoffman, and this pattern is still to be released, but it has been released to her patrons. And this is knit in Thrive held single on 3 millimeter needles, along with Plotulopi for the contrast color. Here you can see that although it is held single, because you are using a smaller gauge needle, the fabric is quite dense. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, that you got some useful tips and tricks from it. If you haven't knit with unspun yarn before, if you have knit with unspun yarn and there are any other tips or tricks that I didn't mention that you would like to share with others, feel free to leave them in the comments. Also, if you have any additional questions for me, if I didn't cover anything specifically, be sure to leave them in the comments as well, and I will go ahead and answer them, and maybe if there are enough questions, I might put out a second part to this video. Hopefully once I edit everything, it's not too long, but if you have stuck around this long, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope that you enjoyed this content. If you enjoy my content, as always, please be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. It really helps me grow my channel. And with that, I will leave you here until my next episode, which will be my monthly podcast episode, which will be the first Sunday of March. Have a great one. Bye.